So welcome to today's Swiss B2B Mediation Group webinar. We have the pleasure of welcoming Joe Tirado. For the little background story, Joe and I came across in August last year at the Sri Lanka Ivestor-State Mediation competition. And we had a nice little conversation, and he agreed to come speak in this setting. So I'm very happy that actually we're able to let other people also learn from his experience with Ivestor-State mediation. And maybe Joe, for the beginning, you could say 2 or 3 things about yourself and how you came to Ivestor-State mediation.
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody, and let me wish everyone, I think it's not too late to wish everybody still a happy new year. Let's hope it is. The world's in a very troubled place at the moment, so let's hope things can only get better. Let me start by thanking you, Jean-Christophe, for this kind invitation to join you this morning to discuss what I personally think is a really hot topic in ADR that, for reasons I was contemplating while I was waiting to join you, actually, I'm not sure is not really getting the pickup that it should do. So it's great to have this opportunity, I think, to explore further with it. It can be seen, I think, as rather esoteric, but it actually should be much more mainstream. And forgive there's a note of frustration in my voice. It's genuine because I'm scratching my head as to why it's taking so long to get some traction here. But first of all, let me explain. I'm a partner with Spanish law firm. As you can hear from my accent, I'm an English lawyer, but I do have a Spanish background. I'm based in London, and I co-head the international arbitration and ADR team at Garrigues. I've had quite a long interest in commercial mediation, but inevitably, what I have been seeing increasingly in the last few years is the growth of international mediation. I mean, I think the story of mediation across Europe and indeed across the world is patchy and different, and everybody has a different view on it. We essentially started in the early 80s, I suppose, to really embrace our mediation as an alternative to litigation, really, in parallel with arbitration. And we've had some success at that. I think we have to acknowledge that in terms of comparing with others, but equally, I think we share a lot of frustrations other people do, that there seems to be a bit of a glass ceiling. But inevitably, as I say, so it's been predominantly the first years were much more in the domestics field, but I, as part of that, do a lot of international arbitration work and transaction work. And so seeing a growth and a desire for mediation and an interest in that. And part of that, of course, is dealing with states, either states themselves in their own capacity or state entities. And invariably, we've also seen a lot of growth in the Ivestor-State space. So it's kind of overlaps from a different perspective. My involvement in general commercial mediation, but the Ivestor-State side of it is definitely much more recent, which is part of the reason why we're having the conversation today. Because I think what I was going to say really, first of all, I think I just saw Birgit join us. Lovely to see you, Birgit. Long time no see. Wonderful to have you with us. But because time is short, let me just say there has been relatively little written on the subject. For those who are interested, and hopefully we do provoke some interest to read a little more, if I can refer you rather immodestly to my own article that I co-wrote with Mark Appel from IMI, that Birgit will know very well. We wrote an article together in advance. There was a lot of noise about the new rules that were coming up with ICSID. And so in advance of that, Mark and I collaborated on an article on that we called Ivestor-State Mediation, New Tools for Policymakers, and that appeared in Transnational Dispute Management in February 2020. So that kind of takes you through a little bit more about the context. I'm going to try and touch on that now, but as I say, forgive me if I kind of gallivant a little bit through. There are some source materials. I also wrote a kind of an update on that, a more concise version in the JAMS blog of October 2022. I'm going to share with you, I'm going to try, if I may, just bear with me a second, trying to, if I can just share the presentation I have for you. And then all of these resources and sources that I'm referring to, if it comes up, if the technology is going to work with me, it's. Oh, sorry, it says that you've blocked the ability for me to share the screen. Jean-Christophe, I don't know if we can change that, but in any event, let me just say we will circulate the copy of the presentation, so you'll have all the resources. If I may direct you, I don't think Julia is with us, but Julia Young has written, I think, the definitive article on the subject. So I take my hat off to her. It's very recent. It was in the ASA Bulletin of June. You have it there. Well, you know what I'm saying is true. June 2022. It's very comprehensive.
I suggest we send a compilation of all these links afterwards to everyone who participates.
Yep, no, absolutely. So I just wanted to flag it that I know I'm going to go quite quickly, and people.
You should be able to share. You should be able to share screens now.
Let me see if that's a. Here we go. Indeed. So. Is that should see you see that?
Works well.
Hey, sometimes I surprise myself. There we go. Right. So fingers crossed. I just get. So I'm going to give you a little background context and talk about the recent developments in ISDS, why mediate ISDS claims, that's investor-state dispute claims, types of cases that are suitable for investor-state mediation, when to mediate, remedies, developing trust in ISM, practical considerations, and some concluding thoughts. A lot to cover in a very short period of time. So as I say, forgive me, I'm going to kind of fly through them, but I hope it will give us some food for thought and some points to discuss between us afterwards, because I think that's how we all learn and debate. So really my objective and priority is really more of shining more light on this important subject, and hopefully this will be a further catalyst for developing it and spreading the word further. So if we start off with
would you rather have the participants in this cozy conversation chip in their questions directly to you when they see something, or bundle them in?
Absolutely happy for that to happen. It makes it a bit more of a dynamic discussion. And if it's going to be discussed further on in the presentation, I'll just say, look, hang on a second. But yes, no, feel free to chip in. Hopefully it will be a two-way discussion rather than a rather dull monologue. But I try to make it as interesting as I can.
That's the objective. Can you maximize your screen? Can you maximize your presentation so we see?
I will try.
Yeah.
Is it? I see what not.
Pantalla.
Yes, I don't. No, it's not that. It could be pantalla. Let's see. Negro blanco. No.
Well, if not, let's.
I can't see anything. Yeah, no. I think let's go with what we've got. So, but hopefully you can see that in any event. So I think there is an increasing move towards those involved in investor-state dispute settlement are increasingly incorporating mediation into their advocacy toolkit. I think this investment climate, in particular after the pandemic, and increasingly, I think with the focus on environmental issues with climate change and stuff like that, is changing, and with it, the dispute resolution mechanisms that are being employed to address investor-state issues. So there is, I think, we're chipping into the zeitgeist of a need and a want for change. But this concept isn't new. I think one of the surprising things, it always surprises me every time I say it, is that ICSID indeed was originally designed primarily as a conciliation dispute resolution mechanism. There are those parallel conciliation rules that are there now with the mediation rules, but of course the arbitration rules. So the emphasis was always to consider really more conciliation rather than the aggressive, adversarial, expensive, costly, time-consuming arbitration we've become used to in the last 20 years or so. Of course, for the first 20 years or 30 years of ICSID, nothing happened in any real context. But we've seen an explosion in the investor-state arbitration side, and only 14 cases in the entire history of ICSID for conciliation. So it's an interesting, I think, point just to raise that wasn't the original intention, but somehow or other we've kind of missed the boat. So here's an opportunity, I think, to kind of come back and revisit that whole concept. And indeed, that was very much the rationale behind the ICSID rule changes, both for arbitration, but particularly for mediation, to try and go back to basics, if you like. So I refer to it in the past as almost like a sleeping giant that's beginning to awake. The reality of it is, I think, notwithstanding of it, the mediation rules, there's been relatively little fanfare about investor-state mediation so far. Partly, a lot of this is to do, I think, with timing, the pandemic, people being distracted with other things. There's still a lot of focus on the Singapore Convention, which is, of course, important, but that's the end of the process. And I think it's you're still seeing far more conferences about the Singapore Convention and the ins and outs of how that worked than this more, I think, important aspect of investor-state mediation. Hopefully that will change as people get to know more that it exists, the opportunities are there, and as words begins to spread. But invariably, I think we have been seeing consistently over the last certainly 10 years or so a pushback regarding investor-state arbitration. The cost of investor-state arbitration, is essentially gone through the roof. It's not uncommon to see arbitrations in the $10 to $15 million type average brackets. There's relatively little data out there, but a survey was carried out a couple of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago. So these numbers are roughly a little bit out of date, number one, but they are based, I think, on having reviewed publicly available ICSID awards and looking at the costs that were awarded at the end of the day. Those who are involved in investor-state dispute will know that these are arguably probably conservative figures. One often sees considerably higher figures. So something like a 50 million tag for an international arbitration, it's not hugely uncommon, and together with that is the time that's involved because of the complexity, and you will often see cases lasting, well, if a major commercial arbitration, something in the 18 months to 2 year mark, it's not uncommon to see investor-state arbitration lasting up to 5 years plus. So there's a real kind of pushback, I think, about the cost and the time. Ultimately, this is one of the difficulties is when you're dealing with government, people taking ownership and responsibility. But this is taxpayers' money. This is my money, your money. Somebody has to pay for this when they're on the other side. So I think there is a push to actually have some accountability as to when people are involved in these type of disputes to the taxpayers to say, hang on, there's got to be a better way of doing things. And I would submit that there are. And I think when you take both the cost and the time, and increasingly what we are seeing, there was a recent report back in October 2023, one of a series of reports that have come out, but actually an increasing tendency for states not to pay. It used to be a bit more the exception, but these are well-known states, including a state I'm very close to my heart, which is Spain, but as most people will know, has been hit very hard with more than 50 claims against it under the Energy Charter Treaty. And Spain is not paying the awards that are being found against it, which raises a really serious question, I think, when you're having countries in the Western Hemisphere that are advocating the rule of law and following the rules, that when the rules don't seem to work against them and they seem to be reneging, it doesn't send a very good precedent to people. But there is a real issue, and I think this report highlighted there was something like 70.5 billion US dollars in award debt remaining unpaid that came out in that report. And you would see that it's a worrying trend, because even within a year, the report focused on the top 20 countries that were refusing to comply to pay their investor-state awards. And that had risen, there was 36 of them in 2022. Last year, 2023, when they did the report, it had risen to 60. So that's almost a 100% increase in reneging states. And so I think it's a worrying state of affairs. Ultimately, clearly, if you're acting for any party, you want to be able, your reward is only a piece of paper, you want to be able to enforce. So I think it's pretty disconcerting when you think you spend that time, you spend that money, and you still may not get to recover your assets for some time, if at all. So there has to be a better way of doing things. And that was part of the rationale for the Global Pound Conference that I wanted to remind people of, that took place a few years ago, but it involved more than 44,000 people in 28 countries around the globe. And that was really an attempt to ascertain what it is that all the major stakeholders, so the parties themselves, the judges, the arbitrators, the mediators, it was the academics, it was the council, clients. Beyond the 4,000 that attended the conferences, there was also some quite significant online contributions to really try and get to the nub of what it is the system should be providing, rather than lawyers thinking that they know what clients want. And essentially, there are only four really key conclusions. It was not rocket science, any of this. And one was efficiency. That was one of the key priorities. But there was definitely a global interest in the use of pre-dispute protocols and mixed mode dispute resolution, including combining adjudicative and non-adjudicative processes. So there is it may be stating the obvious, but I think there is a groundswell of opinion that we need to be doing things in a different way. So, and kind of related to that, what we have seen in the last 10 years plus are major investor-state dispute settlement institutions, including ICSID, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Dispute, the UNCITRAL, the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, the Energy Charter Conference, which has been doing sterling work in this area, have explored dispute resolution needs of their respective user communities and responded with a whole host of initiatives. We've seen procedural changes, rule changes that have been promoted by the IBA, UNCITRAL, and as I've mentioned before, the much vaunted ICSID mediation rules in particular, a series of really helpful guides in the Energy Charter Mediation Guideline. It's I say this with some regret, because as most people know, the Energy Charter Treaty is under attack, and that the whole system is, well, whether it survives or not, well, time will tell, but it's having quite a backlash, partly because it is the very, I think, states who didn't think that they were going to be facing claims are facing them. That is making them question the validity of the Energy Charter treaty in its entirety. But that's an aside and for another day. But they do have some incredibly useful guidelines, particularly, and that's the focus of the article that I referred to at the beginning that Mark and I wrote on, was really just to kind of outline what practical measures states can take on board to really embrace this whole concept of investor-state mediation. We've also seen statutory and regulatory frameworks change, and again, the ECT has proposed a model instrument to follow for states. So it really is a hands-on. It's been a while since I've read it, so I can't remember quite how many pages, but we're talking 20, 30 pages. It's not voluminous. It's very user-friendly. And I think hopefully it makes a useful contribution to all of this to allow states to engage, because I think all too much what we have seen historically on the state side is them sticking their heads in the ground when it happens. There's an element of arrogance in terms of where the state can do what we like. There's an element of ignorance because they have no idea how else to do anything. Of course, it's complicated when you have politics involved. So there are a whole host of reasons why it's not perhaps so surprising that mediation has had has had difficulty in being accepted at the investor state level. But as I say, I think the anecdotal note is from ICSID itself, which is why they invested so much time and effort, was that there is a real desire. And I think I have seen, when I've acted for states, again, a desire to do things differently. So I think there is the mood music is changing, but inevitably, I think we have a relatively short window of opportunity. Personally, otherwise this will just seem to be another initiative that will be forgotten, probably dusted down in 10 years' time as all brand new all over again. But I'm really very keen and feel very passionate that we should be exploring this, pushing this, encouraging it in every way that we can. So again, grateful for you for showing interest, and interested to hear from you in our conversation as to what difficulties you see or how we can better promote it. Of course, the Singapore Convention that I mentioned at the beginning has really been picked up momentum in the last few years. Initially, it was a little bit slow to get going, but has every sign of being a very successful convention. And again, is an important instrument, I think, in the overall scheme for investor-state dispute settlement. And also NGOs we've seen, particularly the IBA, the International Bar Association, and IMI, there are a number of the call I think are involved with IMI, have been very instrumental again in their in their work in this area, and assisting organizations such as the Energy Charter Treaty in developing the guidance and instruments that they have. So moving on, why mediate ISDS claims? In reality, and this is where I think it brings it home, this is what you would say for nearly any mediation presentation. There are nuances, I think, for investor state, but essentially, whether it's commercial or almost any other type of mediation, these are not unusual things to be highlighting as to why you should be mediating. So just to run through them very, very quickly, they're there in bullet form, but obviously both internal and external cost savings. I've mentioned that at the very beginning. It is disproportionately high in investor state, the cost, so that clearly has to be a major incentive. The opportunity to reach a relatively quick and early settlement. I mean, timeframes, instead of the years that I was talking about in arbitration, we're talking potentially weeks, months. Even if it's something that's like 6 months, is considerably less than would be in a normal arbitration. Having a third-party mediator feedback on claims can help unblock, remove roadblocks to settlement and possible avenues to resolution. Again, this is all going to be familiar territory. When used early, as invariably, I think the real value of all of these mechanisms is when they're used early. I think you get the most out of it. But it's also, I think it's very flexible avenue for exploring critical relationship management, such as working with a particular subcontractor, confidentiality. You have within although there is obviously a tension between transparency and confidentiality in a mediation scenario. FDI initiatives. I mean, I don't think there's anything worse in terms of publicity as seeing any kind of disputes for investors. Investors will still invest if the return is good, and notwithstanding the risk, but clearly there are many states that are looking for foreign direct investment. And this is a way of avoiding, and I think this enhances that credibility that you're a safe jurisdiction as an investment, where you're prepared and willing to look at mediation rather than engage in the old hack, expensive, costly arbitration. Of course, it helps get greater clarity on each party's view on the issues in dispute, and provides a better basis for seeing the pathway to a negotiated settlement, and parties maintain control of the process. All of that, I think, none of that is different from what one would normally see. It's particularly again, this is not similar to normal mediation, if you like, where it's particularly well suited, but not exclusively, where both investor and state have an interest in maintaining an ongoing relationship, which they often do, whether it's part of the same transaction or new transactions that an investor wishes to bid in. That it helps maintain that relationship. It's also really helpful if the only issue is quantum. Mediation serves parties by expanding the perspective beyond sums and allowing the identification of a quantum range and similarly valued non-monetary remedies. So it might be a change in the law. There may be other aspects there, because often states don't have the money to pay. So you'll have to needing to be creative, and I think mediation gives you that scope to be creative for looking for non-monetary redress whereas ordinarily might seem the more obvious form of going forward. Again, it should obviously be considered as an early part of the party's investments claim resolution process before disagreements hardened in the dispute. So that's part, I think, of the management. But often you'll see in treaties a cooling off period that are often ignored. It just gives parties 6 months to prepare for the arbitration rather than engaging meaningfully in trying to avoid that very arbitration that you're trying you wish to not have. And so I think there is a real mindset. There is a cultural change that is required, but it's through, I think, education and realization of that the process exists, that will come about, but it will take time. And then the mediation will work best where a state has implemented a framework within which negotiations can take place and state officials feel empowered and authorized to settle matters without fear of repercussions and in accordance with the existing law. That is probably sums up in 3 lines what the biggest hurdle has been, I think, to states actively engaging. There was no real framework for doing that. The the Energy Charter Treaty instrument that I mentioned before kind of sets out, and the guidelines sets out what you need to do to embrace it as part of domestic law, maybe the domestic procedures, but setting up clear ministries, responsibilities, and authorizing parties to be able to engage and feel empowered without the risk of, with a regime change, of them being accused of corruption, of on all the usual hurdles that come up there. It's not without its difficulties, but these are surmountable issues. All I'm going to mention here, because I'm conscious time is already rushing ahead. So when to mediate, as in most cases, early, generally better rather than late, but invariably you can mediate at any time. I think you can have some success in encouraging that mediation by looking, it's the carrot and stick thing, but if you look like you're really serious but reluctant to initiate an arbitration, you can have draft proceedings, send it to the parties to say, look, if you don't engage with me, you leave me with no alternative, I'm going to go. And in my experience, investors are generally really reluctant for a whole host of reasons to engage with the state. So it's normally it's a question of last resort that they engage. So there are ways of encouraging the state. I've mentioned the cooling off period. Considering mediation should be considered in parallel with investor-state arbitration proceedings. So even though an arbitration is up and running, there's no reason why mediation, as in any other dispute, could not be run in conjunction. Whether you stay the proceedings or not is another question. I certainly would not. I think you need to separate the arbitration from the mediation, so you have different parties. Some jurisdictions have a different view on that, but I think the general consensus, certainly in the common law world, is that you separate and have different individuals acting as arbitrator and mediator. And then I think what is, regardless of timing, counsel familiar with commercial mediation should be prepared for a lengthier mediation process. You need to be, I think it's all in the nuances and the subtleties, I think, rather than the general ballpark figure of these are slightly different from your normal mediations, as you would expect. And I think those who are most successful are most likely to get more out of the process are those that appreciate the subtleties and the nuances of investor-state mediation. But if the message I would say is this is not beyond the reach of anybody. And I think a lot of it is hopefully, in many cases, self-evident and common sense. I've already mentioned, I think, in terms of remedies, it's particularly, I think, in the addressing non-contractual economic, social, political needs in addition to contractual issues. Sometimes it's the money issue that is the least currency for settlement purposes, kind of touched on that already, because budgets are set, highly constrained by law, and will require multiple levels for approval. So what works is where a settlement can be devised that is a positive outcome for the investor and the state, that is executable within the boundaries of the applicable legislative framework. Put simply, win-win for everybody all around. One alternative to damages is to arrange for a new investor to buy out the investment. If a range of damages can be agreed in mediations, the parties can create similar value through a host of non-monetary settlements, regulatory change I've alluded to before, extra contractual commitments such as labor contract commitments, community or environmental improvements, and new contracts. So there's a whole host of things that one can play with and be creative with. And with contract renegotiation, delivery schedules, unit pricing is also an attractive option. Procurement laws and regulations will need to be respected, of course. And the design process for mediation will permit stakeholders, in addition to the direct parties to the dispute, to be built in so that a more comprehensive settlement can be achieved and broader remedies agreed. It's a deceptively short sentence to cover a really important aspect, because many of this investor state stuff, particularly if you've got environmental issues, will involve local communities. And to be able to bring in parties that you wouldn't ordinarily, there wouldn't be parties to an arbitration, or that you couldn't compel to join an arbitration, it makes it much more complicated, of course, but it means you settle it. So we'll have a far greater scope for settling most of the issues that arise in the dispute. There are a whole host of reasons. I'm going to aim, I can see I've passed my 20 minutes, JC. I'm going to aim to finish by 30 minutes if you'll allow me, because I'm getting close to the end.
What you were saying, if I may, and that was all these benefits that you're describing that you can have through a mediated negotiation, really, that's stuff that you cannot have with investor-state arbitration, because it's basically having a fixed mindset and a growth mindset approach with mediation. And with arbitration, you have a fixed mindset because the facts are clear and those are the positions, and the arbitral tribunal at exit will only be able to discuss what has happened in the past. And I think this is, the biggest benefit of going for investor-state mediation, because you get that upside of shaping the future, no?
Well, look, if you're asking me, you're pushing at an open door. I think it's so obvious. It does frustrate me. I'm trying to be polite with my frustration. I can't. To be honest, there's always been historically, and again, there are reasons for it. I think there's always been a view, both by states and investors, that serious disputes are not don't get resolved by mediation. There is this perception of it all being woolly and soft, and so if it's a serious dispute, it must go to arbitration and litigation. And I think there has been that mindset, whereas I think what I really want to make clear, and you've kind of touched on, that this has the capability, in fact, of doing way more than an arbitration or a litigation could ever do. It needs to be given more intelligent thought as to who's party to it. But I think it has. The difficulty is, if you oversell anything, people always get suspicious, and so you don't want to sound overly evangelical about it. But at the same time, it frustrates me, because I do think it's capable of doing so much more than what's currently on offer for a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and bottom line, with a far greater satisfaction rate, if you like, because it involves everybody and stakeholders. But it does need thinking about. But so, and I think that kind of touches on this slide, your comment, JC, and thank you for that. Is that I think there is a kind of inherent distrust or skepticism, or historically an unwillingness to consider mediation, notwithstanding, as I say, the whole genesis or history of ICSID itself was conciliatory based. And those that have, conciliation is slightly different from mediation, but those that have done anything in that space will know it's not that different, and the concepts are very similar. So it surprises me, and that it's not more engaged. But of course, I think one of the important things is to have these kind of state regulatory frameworks in place. So, as I say, that you have the infrastructure ready and waiting in anticipation, rather than historically responding often late, ill-prepared, but you're actually addressing these issues that are coming. And I think it's kind of slightly, I would even go as far as saying it's negligent not to address this if I were advising a state. I think they need to be facing this and enhancing their own position by being much better prepared than they have been historically, arguably. By effectively contracting out, there's a lot they can do in-house as well. But yeah, as I say, I think a lot of the difficulty is just that really is basic of thinking that mediation is not capable of dealing with such complex disputes, whereas it clearly can be. There isn't a lot in terms of case studies to report on. There isn't a whole host of this going on. There's still relatively few that are happening, but hopefully through events like this and spreading the word, we will change that, and we will see more investor-state mediation taking place. So I think the rest of that, I don't think there's anything I really need to make a particular stress. Let me go. So practical considerations. Again, it's all very well talking about the theory, the history, the frustrations, but actually what practical considerations are there? Well, clearly having an authority, an ability to recommend settlement. So I think accountability is really important. That's particularly important, I think, for states. Invariably, you'll find, I've had first-hand experience of this, departments, ministries fighting between themselves. So having a clear line, a chain of command is really important. We have multiple disputes, obviously looking to bring those in. There's no point settling one and then having to do it all over again. If you're connected, you will know that there are other issues either in play or likely to be in play. So I think being aware of that, stakeholder mapping and inclusion. So rather than dealing with what you're faced with, really trying to, again, related to what I was saying before, trying to step back and see the wider picture and ensure that all those that need to be involved are involved and are represented and are included and as part of the process. An important point that I think we discuss inevitably, we're all looking for these appointments. Traditionally, I think, one looks at the single mediator. I think I'm a big fan of co-mediation in commercial mediation anyway, or almost any mediation. It's a tough gig as a mediator, as we all know. But I think given the complexity, you can just imagine now the multiple parties involved having, at the very least, co-mediators, or you may even want more than two, to help manage, process the proceedings is something to be actively considered. I'm really a big fan of diversity generally. So I think the male-female dynamic is really important. The cultural dynamic is important. So I think there's a huge area, and I think when you look at the kind of costs involved, these are, I think, relative peanuts in terms of having somebody else involved. I've never met a mediator yet who claims he's overpaid or she's overpaid. We all know that we get underpaid for the value added, I think, to the process and the value that can be saved both in time and cost. So I think there's a real scope for exploring that pool. There's a relatively small pool of recognized investor-state mediators. That's growing. Birgit is on a panel with that. I'm only aware of one institution at the minute that has a dedicated panel. I think there's only about 15 or 18 of us, that kind of number, but there's obviously scope to increase that. And I think, as I say, it's always much more fun, number one, and much more, I think, rewarding when you can mediate with someone else. Of course, you need to. The issue.
Let's talk numbers for a second, because I remember when we both spoke at the Intercontinental Conference there in Nairobi. I found one thing really remarkable. The average duration of investor-state arbitration, you said, is between 5 and 6 years. Yeah. And for the mediation, around 6 months?
Yes.
I mean, compared to regular business mediations, this is a relatively long period of time, but compared to another investment state process, this is extremely quick. So, I mean, it's still surprising why there's so much holding back of going down that route. And in terms of numbers of investor-state disputes that have been mediated, are there statistics on numbers you can share with us?
No, there isn't, because I think candidly, there is it's not reported on the public register. Number one, so it is anecdotal, and I know that from ICSID, it's relative. They haven't had much call up as yet. I know of the 2 conciliations because I actually was involved in the last 2 conciliations. But I think that's and in fact that was an interesting one, because the first one I was involved in, I was actually the presiding commissioner on the conciliation commission. But the last one, which is, and this is in the public domain, I'm acting as counsel, and it's very interesting to see the internal conversations we've had with the client. I mean, it's a major shipping client, and I think their view, and so the issues about reluctance to arbitrate against the state. They would say this openly. They are reluctant, but they're frustrated. It's been going on, the particular dispute, for quite a while. But their whole view to, if there's another way of doing this in a cheaper, quicker way, they are prepared, more than willing to explore. And that's why they've gone in this particular case down the conciliation route. But I mean, all I can. It begs the question why, JC, and I think what I find frustrating still in the commercial mediation world, and I'm sure I'm not alone, how many people still really don't, both lawyers and their clients are still not familiar about the advantages of mediation just generally, let alone the fact that you can even mediate an investor-state dispute. And as I say, the immediate thing is you'll get this kind of slight hesitancy and reluctance, thinking, well, that's not really for this kind of heavyweight stuff, is it? So I'm afraid we're fighting against the risk of, well, it's going to be rude, but there is inherently ignorance, but we all have to start somewhere. And I think the more we understand that this is available, and dare I say, the more clients understand, because they all too often abdicate responsibility, but actually a lot of this can come from clients. And when clients start hitting lawyers over the head and saying, number one, why aren't you telling me about this? Because your competitor's just been on the phone to me, or I've had a lunch with them and they've been telling me I had this option that you never mentioned. I think that they have a real important part to play, because the lawyers will react to that. But of course, the good lawyers, and as everybody on here are the proactive lawyers that are ahead of the game, that are looking for these opportunities, because ultimately, yes, I mean, there's always been a tension, let's face it, between generating fees if you're in a law firm and settling disputes. But ultimately, that's what I would say. There are professional, clear guidelines that you put the client's interest first ahead of our own. And it's amazing how often one doesn't see that. But there are real benefits, I think, from a practice development point of view, because you build trust with the client, they will come back, word would spread. So I think it's in our own collective interest, and it's rather short-sighted, I think, of those who are sticking their head in the ground and just wanting to do things the old way. Let me just conclude, I think, so recognition of settlement agreements. The reality of it is, and I think I'm a big fan of the Singapore Convention. Don't get me wrong. I was involved in some of the preliminary committees that were looking and proposing it. But it is I've rather disparagingly said, it's a solution in search of a problem, because I think realistically, and certainly my experience, there isn't really parties not a problem with parties not recognizing the settlement agreements, partly because of the dynamics, how they've reached the settlement agreement. It's a consensual document rather than it being imposed. But nonetheless, I think obviously you're wanting to do everything. And I think that this is why the Singapore Convention is a force for good. Anything that removes those kind of barriers, prejudice to mediation. And so you have a convention as broad as the Singapore Convention to say, well, look, that gives additional comfort for mediation is obviously a benefit, but needs to be thought of in terms of when you're drafting your mediation agreement. I think with that, that formally, yes, just formally brings me to the end of the presentation, and hopefully we can expand further on the discussion part. But again, look, apologies. I know it's a whirlwind. I will share with JC the presentation for you to kind of read more at your leisure. Julia's article, as Jean-Christophe was waving in the beginning, is excellent. Basically tells you all you need to know about investor-state mediation. But I just hope, if nothing else, I don't to leave you with a thought. This is something that's open to all of us. This isn't something that a special esoteric group over there. It should become part of the mainstream. And I think certainly if you're doing anything that involves a government, and I'm keen to work with you, share ideas how we might expand it and to get it going, because as I say, it's been a little frustrating. There have been one or two events. Indeed, Jean-Christophe mentioned, and he and I attended the first moot event for investor-state mediation in Sri Lanka last year. So there are one or two things out there advertising it, but I'm really worried this is going to end up being like a hot topic or relatively warm topic for a moment that seems all a nice idea and just gets put back on a shelf for a while. And for the reasons we've just been touching on, and I know you have a real interest, Jean-Christophe, because it does seem to be, the benefits seem to be so obvious and such a kind of no-brainer. It's a little bit frustrating that it isn't more widely known and certainly more widely used. And I'm still finding when I'm raising it, people are looking at me as if to say, I didn't know you could do this. So with that, thank you for your indulging me, and I hope that's given some kind of an overview. But I mean, without further ado, Jean-Christophe, I hope that's enough to stimulate some debate. And happy to, if anybody disagrees, please share that, or agrees, or has any other comments. I think we can all benefit. Nobody has a monopoly of knowledge in all of this, and as I say, I think we're all. It's a brave new frontier, but I think something we can embrace and should be doing a lot more.
I think Ralph wants to react, and then Birgit.
Thank you very much, Joe. Nice seeing you again. It was very, very interesting. Yeah, as you may know, I mean, I was the mediator for the last ICSID mediation, the very first, and I think last ICSID mediation. And I did a couple of investor-state mediations. And my experience is, and of course, I mean, just to answer a couple of things, we were two. I mean, for the ICSID mediation, it was a mediation with an African state. So what was very interesting is the other mediator was not a mediator, but someone who was doing lots of negotiations and also a specialist of African law and African culture and behavior. A Frenchman, delicious man, and it was very, very helpful to understand also how to tackle, how to discuss, how to lead a process with an African government. I had a couple of other experiences before, but this one was also on the verge of moving the government. So we have lots of issues, to my point of view, with respect to investor states in non-democratic countries. I had another one where we mediated in Paris, also an African state, somewhere in Africa. The first one was in the finance business, so, and lots of money. I mean, we're talking about 4 billion case. And the other one was in the telecom industry, where you had a European telecom agency who had invested, of course, in this African state. And after 10 years, they wanted to go out. And after 10 years, the Africans wanted them to deliver more, saying, you came over, you took everything out. And the Europeans saying, we came in and you never took anything from us. And what was interesting in this second case, which was the first one historically, was we found an agreement even though the parties at the table were quite difficult, because on the European side, they had understood who should be there, who could negotiate, who had the negotiation power, and so on. On the state side, it was much more difficult because they came along with the Minister of Justice. They came along with the president of the Supreme Court. But they had a whole team of negotiators, and thank God the negotiators understood what it was about while mediating. And so we found an agreement, but when we had to sign it, the chief negotiator of Africa said, and I'll say it in French, Madame s'embête. No, I'll say it in English. It was great. I mean, we really had an excellent time. I mean, we mediated, I think 3 times, 3 days. Pretty important, as you understand, topic and money-wise and so on. And he said, the agreement is excellent, but you have to understand, I would like to see my children growing up.
Well, that's yeah, no, I mean, that's yeah, it brings it home. It's not a
So here we are, okay? And so meaning, and we had the same issue with the other one I talked about with the financial branch. And what, I mean, in the first one, they said to me, listen, you know what? We're going to go to arbitration. We know we are going to lose. We're not going to be able to pay. They will not be able to enforce. And it's going to be, you know, the arbitration of colonialism as we are used to. The white men are going to win and we are going to lose. It's okay. And in the other one, the ICSID one, of course, I cannot talk about that, but my impression was we had a real issue on who was at the negotiation table. And by the way, it was very interesting because we used video conferences. It was in the midst of COVID. And so at some point in time, we were at the World Bank in Paris, sometimes by video conference, sometimes by video conference only there in order to have a secure system. Okay. But what was interesting is there, they could not come with the persons who would be the highest person in the hierarchy. But we knew at the video conference, there was more than the 2 negotiators present. So we could pass on messages like, yeah, I mean, if by any chance you talk to the minister of blah, 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 maybe this is a message you want to pass. So very interesting use of video conferences. We always say this is difficult, blah, 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 but you have lots of positive effects too. But at some point in time, what you realize is the people need to make a commitment. And frankly, in this kind of states where you don't know what kind of push is going to happen next week, now you are friend with the president, but tomorrow maybe this is not the case anymore. Can you afford to mediate? And this is a real issue. But with respect to the rest, I mean, with democratic countries, and I know I have been part of a working group at some point in time in order to implement investor-state mediation for tax issues. At some point in time, it was going pretty well. And at some point in time, I don't know exactly what happened, but it disappeared because, I mean, tax authorities are used to negotiate with all the parties and so on. So this is certainly also a topic which could be easily implemented, but it's going nowhere from what I see. And for the other questions, investor-state, I do also arbitrate in a couple of issues, and I see that everybody talks about mediating, But at some point in time, they need to go the route of arbitration because they feel this is a safe one. And in the midst of the arbitration, there will be, like I'm in an arbitration right now, where we arbitrators propose to the parties to have a discussion about where we think the case is going to be in a couple of whatever years. And we're talking millions of fees already. And where parties are realizing, okay, maybe we are going to look into some kind of conciliation or, good offices or whatever. So just to say, another thing I wanted to say is, for instance, with the exit mediation, with other mediation in investor-state disputes, but could also be commercial disputes, we need to think about the involvement of the World Bank. We need to think about the involvement of diplomacy, of financial institutions who are going to be agreeing to pay those states which have no money the necessary means in order to meet their commitments, which adds, of course, a difficulty because the World Bank is coming and say, listen, we have already difficulties in getting back or getting our loans repaid. So do we really want that? And finding another financing organism or company is extremely difficult. So just a couple of thoughts I wanted to share, because of course I have seen lots of articles and I have worked a lot with Frauke Nietzsche from ICSID and so on. And I worked a lot, as you know, with Gabrielle Kaufmann-Kohler. Gabrielle was my mentor when I was a stagiaire avocate. So she really was at the start of my career. And Gabrielle was raising this investor-state arbitration question issues with respect to cost and so on a long time ago. And she came over to me a couple of years ago and said, Birgit, can't we do something with mediation? I said, of course, but how? And another person who is very keen behind that is a great arbitrator, Pierre Tercier. He's doing that also as, promoting mediation. He's not a mediator, but he knows exactly what it is about. I'm sorry. So just to say, great topic. In reality, quite some concerns.
If I may just jump in quick, that's fantastic hearing it from the front line, if I may say so, Birgit. I'm not surprised that you've been involved right from the start on these cases. But I think all of what you've raised are no surprise. And I think, historically the reasons, so it is difficult. I don't want to gloss over it to say that it's difficult, but I do feel there is a window of opportunity, and I stress again, I think it's a short window of opportunity where we can revisit this and actually approach this instead of putting up the old arguments, which are all valid, but actually coming up with concrete solutions to go forward. And I think we all have a role to play, I think, in making that happen. Now, of course, we can all just turn around and say it's all just too difficult anyway, and it'll go away, or revolt back to type, whether it's the colonial argument or what have you. But that's fascinating here. It saddens me to hear it, but I'm not surprised to hear the experience you've had. But so forgive me. I see Ralph has had his hand up for a long time, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Ralph, I think you're on. Hello, Ralph.
There we are. Yeah, great
nice
to see you. Yes, great to see you, and Birgit as well. Hello, many nice colleagues here on board. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a short question, and I'll spend 2 minutes setting the scene first. For those who haven't met before, I'm coming from in-house, so I'm actually working as managing counsel for an international corporation within the energy business and shipping and so forth. Many moons work in this corporation. But besides that, I take a particular interest in mediation, actually accredited and certified, and also do quite a lot of mediations, mainly pro bono because of the fact that I'm in-house counsel. So that's a bit about the background. Now, let me try to set the scene for my question, and I'll come to my question. First, I think we need to rethink a bit. I think investors going abroad, investing, as you know, many of these have quite rigid sustainability commitments and actually have made it very clear to their owners, shareholders, stakeholders, NGOs, and so on. We do business in a sustainable way wherever we are located. That's more and more becoming the agenda for doing business today globally. With those words, if things go wrong and you are facing a clash or a conflict just outlined in this session, we need to have the same mindset. We need to live up to our responsible business conduct in that country. We need to question, is it right, is it correct for us to take a traditional litigation arbitration view, or should we look into the future and live up to our commitments? That's the first question. The values come into play, the long-term values, reflecting to shareholder value, reflecting to easy access to finance, reflecting to NGOs, reflecting to a place where people want to work and suppliers want to do business with us, and so forth. So that said, the mindset today is slightly different. I think we would be very open to question, oh gosh, I know we have these traditional means and mechanisms to resolve conflicts, meaning an arbitration, litigation, whatsoever. But we need to be more and more open-minded and look into the option of ADR and mediation, especially in these kind of situations. And it also connects to my annual responsibility to do sustainability reporting to all stakeholders, shareholders, lenders, financiers, NGOs, those who follow our business, where we then outline how we are conducting our business in a responsible way and keeping sustainability and ESG at the forefront of our minds. So that said, I come to my question and I'll stop there. Have you, Joe, come across that these type of angles, these type of, we need to keep this in mind. That's why we need to engage in mediation and have this investor-state mediation as a true and sort of the gateway to resolve issues. Is it coming? Have you seen it? Is it coming, this kind of argumentation?
Well, Ralph, thank you for that and sharing that with us. I mean, yes, I can't say in depth, but I think clients like who you represent, it's not your client. Obviously, we've not rehearsed this question, just for the sake of full disclosure. But I am seeing clients that are taking a different view. I think the pandemic has shaken things up in lots of different ways that perhaps a number of people haven't foreseen. It's very easy to kind of perhaps, but it gave us the opportunity to perhaps rethink things. I mean, in answer, you phrased the question, should we live up to our commitments? My response to that, and obviously it'd be interesting to hear other people's, I said, absolutely. I think not only is it the right thing to do morally, I actually do think there's a really strong economic case for the reasons we've talked about before, and it's in our own self-interest. Even if you think it's all complete mumbo jumbo and airy-fairy stuff, there's a real hard-nosed commercial economic benefit. And ultimately, I think it kind of goes to Birgit's point as well. I mean, it does seem to be, how do we expect anybody else to follow the rules if we don't follow the rules, or to adopt and change if we're following the same thing? So I think I'm with you, and I think, without wishing to say we're on the cusp of a revolution, because I don't think we're there, but I think this is a moment in time where we can pause and think and start sharing and exploring more other ways of doing it. So the short answer to your question, yes, I am seeing that, but I'm not enough, whether that's with clients or with counsel. And so, but I think Jean-Christophe wanted to jump in. Is it to say that we've run out of time?
No, I think we should keep this interesting discussion. but since you're giving me the floor, it very much reminds me on the need. I work in the space of public-private partnerships, so long-term infrastructure concessions. And what I find difficult there is often negotiations become resinous at some point. And rather than, working to try to resolve and overcome this through systematic dispute prevention, dispute avoidance, to use that as a mediation, as a performance catalyst. I think this is so crucial for projects because you can have this growth mindset rather than just looking, oh, we have negotiated something that doesn't end up working in this project. And then you're in this dead end situation. Unfortunately, very few people are able to break out of this reality. And this is where we need to help them to try to say, this is part of project life cycles, right? Let's work on having a way to overcome it. And so having deal mediation at that point, trying to not wait until it's the very end and the tsunami wave is just about to hit the project and everybody's gonna be a disaster, costing a lot of money and energy, but rather trying to build these mechanisms into the project. I think this is where I see a huge upside for mediation. And of course, yes, before you go to arbitration, try by all means to mediate a settlement that is owned by the parties. Because the other thing that I find so abnormal is that you end up having an arbitration sentence that is not part of your body. I mean, it's other people deciding on what your reality is going to look like for the next years, and you need to own it. But you can't own it if you haven't been part of the decision or the solution-making process, really. And that's where I sometimes say, why is it so difficult to get to that realization? But please, by all means, anyone else, maybe you want to share your opinion. And if not, it's okay. I mean, we've had a really nice conversation, I think, for over an hour on this absolutely interesting topic on investor-state mediation. What I intend to do is collect all these papers that have been circulated or written by you all, so that we can keep the interested crowd informed with the latest on this subject matter.
Maybe just one thing. I mean, and hi, Rolf. Nice seeing you also on the screen. I think what is very important is to have those guys, the other Ralphs, the people who are working for companies and so on, aware. And we try to raise awareness in the CPR European Advisory Board. This is one of the platforms where it can be done. But there are certainly other platforms. There is certainly also a platform of, association of in-house who is having the same very interesting ideas you're having, Ralph, and seeing that not only with the arguments we're usually using, which are of course very pertinent, which are the ones who have been also explained by Joe, but also with respect to sustainability, to the way you manage a company, to the reporting you have to make to the shareholders, and so on and so forth. And where you have to report that, yes, an arbitration, the last arbitration costed, I don't know how many million. And maybe we won this one, but we lost the 5 before. Well, I don't know. I mean, and with respect to the markets, we have reduced because of that our market in I don't know where, Iran, blah 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 blah. Even though nobody dares to talk about Iran. I did a huge mediation with Iran a couple of it was 2 years ago. Okay. And also with respect to the sanctions, US sanctions, and so, I mean, there are lots of things to be mediated also because of the confidential setting, and really it addresses the needs for trying to find a resolution. Maybe there is no resolution and we have to go to arbitration at some point in time, at least for part of it, but it permits to I don't know how to say that in English, élaguer, you know, to take some of the stuff which is just poisoning the whole negotiation away from the road. Just my 5 cents.
Cutting back a couple of branches from the tree.
Yeah,
Shaping the future.
Yeah. But I mean, shaping the future. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe Ralph here, you can help a bit. Or is there an international organization for in-houses? I knew the former president of the association in France, the Conseil juridique, but it's more in-house. Yeah, in-house councils. Laure Lavorel. And they are doing lots of things there also with the former president of the bar and so on, Gerald Schul, Christian and so on. But in the Nordic countries, I have no clue what's happening in Spain. I have no clue what's happening in, you know.
Yeah, if I could, sorry, Birgit, if I may chip in here, you're absolutely right. I think that I mean, there are different forums, and there are several forums. The executive summary for you would be that in-house counsel is very sort of concerned and very sort of what's out there, you know, ESG, climate change, all these kind of big issues are coming there, and we need to be able and ready to resolve them. And I would say that it's not a question of not adhering to well-proven, very efficient, very professional arbitrators like you. I mean, there will always be business there. We just need to expand it a bit, you know, the forum or the mechanism, because not all of these are resolved long-term in courtrooms. You know, you have to live with the decision for many years ahead. And we are monitored by NGOs, we are monitored by social media, we are monitored by financiers, lenders, shareholders, you name it, local communities, and so forth. And we need to be transparent, and we need to live up to our commitments. Reporting is required, detailed reporting is required going forward. And that's the reality which we have and which we are living in. And there are these forums, and coming back to your question, there are several forums, you know, there are climate change, in-house council, you know, you name it. And in the Nordics, yes, we have had quite a lot of discussion about these issues, and you know, it's not a matter of, you know, competitors coming together. It's more or less you share same kind of sort of perspective going forward, and let's discuss how you see and what you see and what I see and what I see, and you know, we can benefit from that. We all want to be good citizens, and we all want to live up to our commitments as in relation to ESG.
If I may, I just wanted to agree with Birgit. The world certainly needs more Ralph Lindbachs with that kind of attitude. Unfortunately, there aren't so many. But I thought it was very interesting. You mentioned social media, which is often we all talk about in the negative, but this is actually, I think, a positive, because you're right. There's so much more scrutiny now. Yep. NGOs, they're watching, reading everything, and so you can talk about the financial aspects of it, but I think Birgit was alluding to as well, you know, it's the reputational damage. And I think that's what you were talking about doing the right thing as well. There are people watching us to see that people do live up to their commitment. So again, it's all about, I think we all have a part to play. It's not just the clients, it's not just the courts, it's not, you know, it's everybody needs to stakeholders in this. And it's obviously about being educated, spreading the word and the culture, and not letting this moment, I think, just dissipate. But there are enough factors there. The ESG argument, I think, is a really good one, and tying that more and more with that is certainly something that can only help us, I think, in the crusade to promote this, which I sort of think, as I say, I think this is in everybody's interest. It's not coming from some kind of altruistic or naive viewpoint. I think this is somewhere where people actually get, I genuinely believe, and having done this for quite a few years, that when you have a negotiated settlement, it's generally much better than any imposed settlement, even if you're the winner, because, you know, it could have adverse effects in all kinds of ways you hadn't anticipated. So, yeah, no, thank you for that.
Fantastic. I think let's be mindful with our time. We've had a wonderful conversation thanks to Joe Tirado. It's amazing how when you just have a little side discussion in this investor-state mediation competition, you can end up producing interesting conversations like this. I just wanted to let you know that the next event is going to be with Kirsten Dodge on 12 March. She's going to speak about dealing with US lawyers in mediations, aka dealing with strategic actors and requests for evaluative opinions. I think this is also going to be a really interesting one, and I invite you to already register today so you don't miss that one. Thanks to everybody who's participated in this Swiss B2B mediation group, which is jointly organized by the Swiss Chamber of Commercial Mediation and Fédération Suisse Médiation, and for all those going to the ICC Mediation Week in 2 weeks. I'm really looking forward to seeing you there.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Yep.
Bye. Nice.